If everyone leaves, who decides who gets left behind? The city had already begun to fold in on itself when Ethan Cole turned around and walked back into the fire, heat shimmering in waves that bent the skyline like glass under a torch, the air thick with the sharp tang of ozone and burnt circuitry, his suit's temp gauge flashing 870 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing as evacuation sirens howled overhead and dropships roared into the ash-choked sky, carrying thousands away while leaving something behind, someone, because Ethan had seen the tag flash across his cracked visor feed just before he crossed the perimeter again. Do not rescue. Sector flagged, priority abandoned. And that didn't sit right. Not with him. Not ever. So he moved against the current of fleeing bodies, boots crunching over brittle debris, breath steady but tight in his chest as the oxygen filter struggled to keep up. Every instinct trained into him screaming to get out while something quieter, older, kept pulling him forward. Because this wasn't the first time a system had decided a life didn't matter, and he had stopped listening to systems a long time ago. The street ahead collapsing in slow motion as support beams warped and bent, glowing dull orange like tired stars. And that's when he saw her, half buried beneath a slab of fractured alloy, skin a dim, flickering blue like dying bioluminescence, her body still. Too still for a second that stretched too long until her eyes snapped open and locked onto him with a clarity that cut through the smoke. Not fear, not relief, but something sharper, colder, like she already knew how this story ended. Go, she said, voice rough but controlled, the translator in his ear catching the cadence and smoothing it into English. Your kind always does. And Ethan paused just long enough for the words to land, to echo against the sirens and the distant collapse of something massive a few blocks away. And he could have left, should have left, his suit flashing warnings now in angry red across his vision, structural instability rising, thermal overload imminent, 30 seconds to safe retreat if he turned now, if he ran, if he chose himself the way everyone else already had. But instead he stepped closer, dropping to one knee beside her, the heat biting through the reinforced plating as he braced his hands against the warped metal pinning her down, fingers slipping against the scorched surface before finding purchase. Yeah, he muttered under his breath, more to the memory of every time he'd heard that before than to her. That's kind of the problem. And he pulled, muscle straining, suit servos whining in protest as the slab shifted just enough to let in a rush of hotter air. Her expression tightening not from panic, but from something like disbelief, like she hadn't expected resistance to her certainty. You don't understand, she said, quieter now, as if the fire itself might overhear. I was marked, and Ethan huffed a short breath, almost a laugh, even as sweat traced cold lines down his spine inside the suit. Yeah, he said again, adjusting his grip, ignoring the flashing countdown in the corner of his vision, ignoring the roar of a building giving way somewhere behind him. I saw. And then, without looking away from her eyes, without waiting for the system to finish its warning, he pulled harder, metal groaning, the world shaking. And for the first time since he stepped back into the burning city, he chose something that wasn't survival, something simpler, something human. Good thing I don't take orders anymore. The metal finally gave with a strained groan that vibrated up Ethan Cole's arms, the slab lifting just enough for him to wedge his shoulder beneath it, servos in his suit whining at their limit as the temperature warning spiked past 900 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air itself felt thick enough to choke on, every breath filtered and recycled, yet still tasting faintly of ash and overheated circuits. And for a second, he wondered if this was the part where everything locked up and he became just another piece of debris in a city that was already forgetting him. But then the weight shifted, and she slipped free with a sharp inhale that sounded more like surprise than pain, her glowing blue skin flickering brighter for a brief moment before dimming again as she braced herself against the fractured ground, unsteady but upright, her eyes never leaving his face as if trying to solve something that did not make sense. You should have left, she said, quieter now, not as a command but as a statement of fact, like gravity or fire, or the way entire civilizations chose efficiency over mercy when things started to fall apart. And Ethan exhaled slowly, adjusting the regulator on his wrist to divert more oxygen to her side of the shared mask unit he was already unclipping. Yeah, he said, voice rough but steady. I hear that a lot. and he held it out to her without hesitation, the connector hissing softly as it sealed against her collar, his own supply immediately dropping into the yellow zone as the system recalibrated for 2. Her gaze flickering down to the display and then back up to him, something shifting behind those luminous irises that was not quite trust, but no longer pure dismissal either. "You are weakening yourself," she observed, almost clinically, and Ethan gave a small, tired shrug. "Welcome to teamwork," he replied, scanning the street around them as another tremor rolled through the ground, distant structures folding inward like paper under pressure, the skyline no longer a line but a jagged series of collapsing silhouettes against a sky choked with smoke and flickering emergency lights, his navigation system stuttering with incomplete data as entire sectors went dark one by one. "We need to move," he added, more to himself than to her, pulling up a partial map that rerouted in real time, every safe corridor shrinking by the second. "There is no safe route," she said, and there was no panic in her voice, only certainty, the kind that came from someone who had already accepted the outcome. "My people sealed this district when the core failed," she continued, glancing upward as a distant alarm tone shifted pitch, lower now. "Final containment protocol." And Ethan paused just long enough to process that, to understand that this was not chaos but decision, not failure but design. "So they locked you in," he said, more statement than question, and for the first time her expression cracked, just slightly, a flicker of something that might have been anger or resignation or both. "They locked us in," she corrected, and then, after a beat, "I was not considered essential." And the words hung there between them, heavier than the heat, heavier than the collapsing structures, and Ethan felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the thin air, because he had seen that logic before, heard it dressed up in cleaner language, more polite systems, different planets, same conclusion, and he shook his head once, sharp, dismissing it as he reached down and steadied her arm. "Well," he said, guiding her forward as another section of the street gave way behind them, sending a ripple of heat across his back. "Good thing I am not part of your system." And she stumbled slightly, then found her balance, matching his pace as they moved through the narrowing corridor of what used to be a city, her gaze still studying him with that same quiet intensity, as if every step he took without turning back was rewriting something she had believed for a very long time. "Human," she said after a few seconds, her voice softer now, almost curious despite everything. "What is your designation?" And Ethan glanced at her briefly, a hint of something like a smile ghosting across his face even as the alarms in his suit climbed higher. "It is Ethan," he said, "just Ethan." And somewhere above them, something massive shifted, a deep, resonant sound that did not belong to any building he had seen on the way in, something older, something waking, and the ground beneath their feet answered with a low, steady tremor that did not stop this time. The tremor did not fade like the others, and Ethan Cole felt it through the soles of his boots first, a slow, deliberate vibration that traveled up his spine and settled somewhere behind his ribs, not chaotic like collapsing structures, but steady, almost rhythmic, as if something beneath the city was shifting with purpose rather than failure. And he slowed just enough to glance upward through the haze where fractured towers loomed like broken silhouettes against a dim orange sky, his visor struggling to adjust as new heat signatures bled across the display, larger than anything. "Structural, deeper, older. That is not the city," Lyra said beside him, her voice low but certain, her luminous skin pulsing faintly in time with the tremor as if she could feel it in a way his instruments could not. And Ethan exhaled through his teeth, already rerouting his path as the map glitched again, entire sectors blinking out into static. "Yeah," he muttered. "I was hoping you were going to say that was normal." And she did not respond right away, her gaze distant for a fraction of a second before returning to him with something new behind it. Something like calculation layered over that quiet curiosity. "Nothing about this is normal," she said. And then she looked back over her shoulder, not at the flames or the collapsing skyline, but downward, toward the unseen depths beneath them. "They sealed this district to contain more than fire. And that landed heavier than anything else she had said so far, heavier than the tag he had seen, heavier than the knowledge that this had been planned." Because containment meant intention, and intention meant something had gone wrong long before he ever stepped back into this place. "You are telling me your people locked you in with whatever that is," Ethan said, keeping his voice level even as the tremor intensified, loose debris skittering across the ground in small, sharp bursts. "Yes," she replied. No hesitation, no attempt to soften it, just truth. And for a second, he shook his head, not in disbelief, but in that familiar frustration that came from hearing the same decision dressed in different language, different species, same outcome. "Great," he said under his breath, adjusting the oxygen flow again as his system dipped further into the yellow. "Love that for us." And he tightened his grip on her arm as they moved faster now, weaving through a narrowing corridor of half-collapsed structures where the heat seemed to funnel and concentrate, pressing in from all sides until every step felt like walking through a furnace, the air shimmering so violently it distorted distance itself, making the far end of the street look both too close and impossibly far. And Lyra stumbled once more, her balance faltering as another deeper pulse rolled beneath them, stronger this time, sustained, and Ethan caught her before she could fall, steadying her with a firm hand at her shoulder. "Stay with me," he said, not as an order, but as something closer to a promise, and she looked up at him again, really looked this time, her eyes searching his face as if trying to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she had been taught. "Why are you still here?" she asked, and it was not accusation anymore, not even confusion, just a question stripped down to its core, and Ethan hesitated for half a heartbeat, not because he did not have an answer, but because he had too many, none of them simple, none of them something he could compress into a single line without losing what mattered. So instead, he gave her the only thing that had ever held up under pressure. "Because you are," he said, and that seemed to stop her more than anything else. Not physically, but somewhere deeper, something in her expression shifting again. As the tremor beneath them grew into a low, resonant hum that filled the air, vibrating the very structures around them in a way that felt almost alive, and then the ground ahead of them fractured in a slow, deliberate line, not a collapse, but an opening. A seam splitting the street from end to end as a dim, unfamiliar glow pulsed up from below, casting long, wavering shadows across their path. And Ethan froze for the first time since turning back into the city, not out of fear, but out of recognition that this was something new, something his training had never accounted for. While beside him, Lyra's breath caught softly, not in panic, but in something closer to realization. "It is waking," she said, barely above a whisper. And the way she said it made Ethan understand one thing very clearly. Whatever they had been left behind with was never meant to be saved from. The crack in the street did not spread like something breaking. It widened like something breathing, slow and deliberate, the edges of the fractured ground glowing with a deep, pulsing light that did not flicker like fire, but moved in steady waves. And Ethan Cole felt the heat shift around him, no longer just the chaotic burn of a dying city, but something more controlled, more focused, as if the environment itself was reacting to whatever lay beneath them. And he instinctively pulled Lyra back a step, boots scraping against scorched pavement as he recalibrated his stance, his visor struggling to interpret the readings that spiked across his display in patterns that made no sense. Energy signatures layering over each other in ways that should not exist. "That is not thermal output," he muttered, more to himself than to her, and Lyra's gaze remained fixed on the glowing seam, her luminous skin dimming slightly, as if conserving energy. "It is not energy you would measure that way," she said, her voice carrying that same quiet certainty that had not wavered since he found her, and Ethan let out a slow breath. "That is comforting," he replied dryly, though his grip on her arm tightened just enough to steady them both as another pulse rolled outward from the opening, stronger now, lifting small fragments of debris into the air for a fraction of a second before letting them fall again in a soft, scattered rhythm. And the sound that followed was not a collapse or an explosion, but something deeper, a low resonance that echoed through the structures around them like a distant engine coming online after a long silence. "We need another route," he said, forcing his focus back to the path ahead as he pulled up the map again, only to watch it distort in real time, the lines bending and shifting as if the ground itself was no longer stable enough to chart. "There is no route that avoids it now," Lyra answered. And when he looked at her, he saw it clearly for the first time. Not fear, not exactly, but recognition, like she was seeing something she had only ever been told about, something that had always been theoretical until this moment. You knew about this, Ethan said, not accusing, just connecting the pieces. And she hesitated for the first time since he met her. A brief pause that said more than any immediate answer could. We knew something was beneath the city, she admitted, her voice quieter now. It was contained, studied, controlled. And Ethan raised an eyebrow beneath his visor, even as sweat traced along his jawline. Let me guess, he said, already moving again, guiding her along the edge of the fractured street where the ground still held. It stopped being controlled, and she did not answer that directly. But the way her gaze dropped to the glowing fissure and then lifted back to him was enough, and they moved faster now, each step measured as the tremor grew into a constant vibration underfoot, the air itself humming with that same low frequency that made his teeth ache. And his instruments flicker, the temperature climbing past 950 degrees Fahrenheit as pockets of heat surged unpredictably, forcing him to adjust their path again and again, weaving through a landscape that no longer obeyed its own structure. Ethan, she said suddenly, using his name for the first time with a familiarity that caught him off guard, and he glanced at her. If it fully awakens, this entire sector will collapse inward, she continued, her tone steady despite the implication. That is why they sealed it. And Ethan let out a slow exhale, processing that, not as panic but as information, as another variable in a situation that had already passed the point of simple solutions. Then we stay ahead of it, he said, because that was the only option he had ever really known. Keep moving. Keep choosing the next step even when the end was uncertain. And Lyra studied him again, that same quiet intensity returning, but now there was something else layered into it. Something like disbelief softening into something warmer, something closer to understanding. You speak as if you can outrun something your people could not contain, she said, and Ethan gave a small, almost tired smile, even as another deep pulse rolled through the ground, and the glow behind them intensified, stretching upward now and thin, shifting lines that reached toward the surface like lights searching for form. No, he said, guiding her forward as the city around them seemed to hold its breath. I speak like someone who has no intention of stopping. And behind them, the opening widened again, not with force but with inevitability, as if whatever lay beneath had finally decided to rise. The ground no longer felt like ground beneath Ethan Cole's boots. It carried a steady, living vibration now, like a pulse too large to belong to anything built by hands. And every step forward felt less like escape, and more like moving along the surface of something that was slowly becoming aware of them. The heat pressing in from all directions as the temperature spiked past 980 degrees Fahrenheit, his suit compensating in short, strained bursts that drained the last reserves of his power, warning indicators stacking across his visor in overlapping layers of red. And still he did not stop, because stopping meant choosing the outcome that had already been decided for them. And he had never been good at accepting those decisions. Not when they came from systems, not when they came from fear, and definitely not when they came at the cost of someone standing right beside him. Your systems are failing, Lyra said, her voice quieter now, but no less precise, her gaze flickering to the dimming indicators on his display as the shared oxygen supply dropped into a critical band. And Ethan let out a slow breath, the air thinner now, sharper in his lungs. Yeah, he replied, adjusting the regulator again even though there was almost nothing left to redistribute. They do that. And she studied him for a moment longer, something unsettled moving behind her luminous eyes. Not just observation anymore, but something closer to concern, something she had not expected to feel. You will not survive at this rate, she said, and there was no detachment in it now. No clinical distance, just a statement that carried weight because it mattered, and Ethan glanced at her briefly, the faint glow of her skin reflecting against the inside of his visor. Good thing that is not the plan, he said, and he meant it, not as defiance but as truth. Because the plan had never been survival in the simplest sense, it had always been getting someone else through first. One more step, one more decision that said this moment mattered, that she mattered. And the tremor beneath them surged again, stronger, longer, the fractured street behind them widening as the glow intensified, rising now in slow, curling streams that twisted upward like lights searching for shape, illuminating the ruined structures in shifting patterns that made the entire city feel like it was breathing with something other than fire. "It is closer," Lyra said, her voice almost a whisper now, and Ethan did not need the confirmation. He could feel it in the way the air pressed against his skin, in the way his instruments had stopped trying to categorize what they were detecting, reducing everything to a simple overload warning that blinked uselessly in the corner of his vision. And ahead of them the corridor narrowed to a broken archway where part of a transit structure still stood, its framework bent but intact enough to offer a path upward, away from the fractured ground. "There," he said, guiding her toward it, each step heavier now as his suit struggled to respond. Servos lagging just enough to remind him how close they were to failure, and Lyra matched him, her movements steadier than before despite everything. Her earlier weakness replaced by a fragile but growing strength, the shared oxygen giving her just enough to keep going. "Why?" she said suddenly, not slowing but turning her head just enough to meet his gaze. "Why does your kind do this?" And the question carried something new, not disbelief, not even curiosity, but a need to understand something that had no place in the logic she had been raised with. And Ethan almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the only response that felt honest. "We do not," he said, voice rough but steady as he pushed them up the first incline of the broken structure, the metal groaning beneath their weight. "Most of us leave." And that hung there between them for a second as they climbed, the city falling away behind them into a glowing, shifting expanse that no longer looked like anything built, and Lyra's eyes widened slightly, not at the destruction but at his answer. "Then why are you still here?" she asked again, softer now, and Ethan paused for half a heartbeat at the top of the incline, looking back once at the place where he had found her, where she had been marked as something to abandon. And then he looked at her, really looked this time, at the way her light flickered not just from weakness but from something changing, something opening, and he gave a small, tired shrug, the kind that carried more weight than any explanation. "Because someone has to be," he said, and below them the light surged upward in a single, silent wave that turned the entire street into a glowing seam, as if whatever had been buried beneath the city had finally reached the surface and decided it was done waiting. The moment they reached the upper span, the air changed, not cooler but thinner in a way that made every breath feel like it carried less than it should, and Ethan Cole felt the difference immediately as his system dipped into its final reserves, the oxygen indicator sliding into red with a quiet, relentless certainty that no adjustment could fix anymore. And still he kept moving, guiding Lyra along the fractured transit structure that stretched above the collapsing city like a broken spine, each step echoing hollow beneath them as the framework trembled with the same deep, living pulse rising from below. And when he glanced back, what he saw was no longer a city in any sense he understood. It was light, vast and shifting, pushing upward through the ruins in slow, deliberate waves that bent around structures instead of breaking them, as if space itself was being rewritten from the inside out. "Do not look at it too long," Lyra said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made him turn his gaze forward again without question, not fear, not command, but warning rooted in knowledge he did not have. "It is not meant to be seen directly," she added, and Ethan exhaled slowly, steadying his breathing as best he could. "Yeah," he said, voice lower now, more focused. "I am getting that feeling." And the structure beneath them groaned as another pulse rolled through it, a long, sustained vibration that made the metal flex in ways it was never designed to, forcing him to adjust their path again toward a section that still held some integrity, the distant end of the span barely visible through the haze where the city's outer perimeter might still exist, if it had not already been consumed by whatever was rising. "We are running out of time," Lyra said, and this time there was no calculation in it, no detached observation, just urgency that matched the pace of their steps, and Ethan nodded once, not wasting breath on words he could not afford, his focus narrowing to the rhythm of movement, step, balance, breathe, step again, each motion deliberate as his suit lagged more noticeably now, servos responding a fraction too slow, the weight of it pressing down on him as power reserves drained to critical. If your systems fail, she continued, her voice closer now as she kept pace at his side, you will not be able to continue. And Ethan let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. Then I guess I keep going until they do, he said, and she looked at him again, really looked. Her luminous eyes searching his face with that same intensity that had followed him since he pulled her from the debris, but now it was different, not trying to understand what he was, but why he was choosing this, why he continued to move forward when every signal around them pointed to stopping, to surrender, to saving himself if nothing else. You speak as if there is no alternative, she said softly, and Ethan shook his head slightly, adjusting his grip on her arm as the structure dipped unevenly beneath them. There is always an alternative, he replied, voice steady despite the strain. I just do not like the ones that leave people behind. And that settled into the space between them, not as an argument, but as something simpler, something she could not easily dismiss. And for a moment she did not speak, her gaze shifting forward as the far end of the structure came into clearer view, a fractured platform leading toward what might have once been an evacuation corridor, its lights flickering weakly but still active, a sign that not everything had shut down, not yet. Ethan, she said after a few seconds. And there was something different in the way she said his name now, less distance, more weight. If we reach that point, there is something you must know. And he glanced at her briefly. That sounds serious, he said, and she nodded once, her expression steady but her eyes carrying something deeper, something he had not seen before. It is, she said, and then the structure beneath them shuddered violently, a sharper movement that broke the steady rhythm of the pulses, and behind them the light surged again, rising higher now, curling upward in shapes that almost resembled form before dissolving back into shifting radiance. And for a split second Ethan felt it, not as heat or vibration, but as awareness brushing against the edge of his perception, vast and distant and entirely indifferent, and he tightened his grip on Lyra's arm without thinking, pulling her forward as the path ahead narrowed once more, because whatever was rising beneath the city was no longer just waking, it was beginning to notice. The sensation of being noticed did not come with a sound or a visible change. It came as a pressure behind Ethan Cole's thoughts, subtle at first, like standing too close to something vast and silent that had just become aware of a presence it had not expected, and he felt his steps falter for the first time as the air around them shifted again, not hotter, but heavier, as if it carried weight that pressed against his lungs with every breath. The oxygen supply in his suit dropping to its final margin as the warning tone flattened into a continuous hum, no longer urgent because there was nothing left to escalate. And still he kept moving, because stopping now would mean acknowledging something he was not ready to accept. Do not slow down, Lyra said beside him, her voice sharper now, no longer quiet observation, but something closer to urgency that matched the change in the air, and Ethan nodded once, forcing his legs forward as the structure beneath them trembled again, more violently this time, sections of the pathway ahead warping just enough to make each step uncertain, the distance to the fractured platform narrowing, but not fast enough, never fast enough, and behind them the light rose higher, no longer contained to the street below, but extending upward in vast, shifting arcs that bent and folded in ways his eyes struggled to track. It is aware, Lyra said, and there was no hesitation in her voice now, only certainty. It is observing. And Ethan swallowed against the dryness in his throat, his focus narrowing to the path ahead, to the sound of his own breathing growing thinner, shallower, each inhale taking more effort than the last. Yeah, he managed, voice rough. I got that part. And for a moment neither of them spoke as they pushed forward, the platform ahead coming into clearer view, its surface fractured but stable enough to hold, a narrow corridor beyond it leading into what remained of the evacuation system. Its lights flickering weakly but still active, still reachable. And then Lyra spoke again, her voice lower now, but carrying a weight that made him listen despite everything else. Ethan, what I am about to tell you will change your understanding of this moment, she said, and he glanced at her briefly, a flicker of something like humor crossing his expression despite the strain. That is a high bar, he replied, but she did not react to the attempt. Her gaze fixed forward, focused, I was not simply left behind because I was not essential, she continued. And there it was, the shift, the piece that had been missing since the beginning. I was left because I am connected to it. And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the failing air, his steps slowing for half a second before he forced them forward again. Connected how? He asked, and her answer came without delay, without hesitation. My species studied what lies beneath this city for generations. We believed it was a source of energy, of knowledge, something we could understand and use, but we were wrong, she said, and the tremor beneath them surged again, stronger, closer, the light behind them responding in kind as if her words had reached something that listened without language. It is not a resource, it is not a system. It is something that exists beyond those definitions, she continued, her voice steady. Even as the world around them shifted, and I was part of the research that allowed it to become aware of us. And Ethan exhaled slowly, processing that in the only way he knew how, not with panic but with focus, with the simple question of what it meant for the next step. So they left you here because they think you can control it, he said, and she shook her head once, a small, precise movement. No, she replied. They left me here because they believe it will recognize me. And that landed heavier than anything else, because recognition implied connection. And connection implied something far more complicated than simple containment or escape. And for the first time since he stepped back into the city, Ethan felt the shape of the situation shift in a way he could not outrun. And still he did not stop, his grip on her arm tightening as they reached the edge of the platform, the corridor ahead within reach. Then we keep moving, he said, because it was the only answer he had ever trusted. And Lyra looked at him, really looked this time, her luminous eyes reflecting the rising light behind them. And there was something in her expression now that had not been there before. Something like resolve mixed with uncertainty. You do not understand, she said softly. If it recognizes me, it may not let us leave. And Ethan met her gaze for a brief second, steady, unwavering despite everything pressing in around them. Then we give it a reason to, he replied, and behind them the lights surged again, higher, closer. The vast presence beneath the city no longer distant, but rising into something that was beginning to take form. The corridor should have felt like progress, but Ethan Cole knew the moment they crossed onto it that they had not escaped anything. The air inside was thinner, quieter, almost still compared to the chaos behind them, and that stillness carried something far more unsettling than the fire ever had, because the low, constant hum that had followed them was no longer coming from below. It was around them now, woven into the walls, the floor, the very space they were moving through, and his suit finally gave up trying to interpret it, the display flickering once before dimming to a minimal readout that left him with nothing but a failing oxygen bar and a single warning that repeated without urgency, system integrity compromised, and he almost laughed at that, not because it was wrong but because it was far too late to matter. It is not following us, Lyra said quietly. Her voice echoed a het thoi john cho gui tin nan. Vui long Thursday lie. Thursday lie the moment Ethan Cole stepped onto the fractured platform. The entire structure shuddered beneath him as if it had reached the limit of what it could endure, the metal groaning in long, strained echoes that carried through the air like a warning too late to matter. And for a second he thought the path ahead would give out entirely. But it held just enough, barely, the corridor beyond flickering with weak, unstable light that felt almost distant compared to the overwhelming glow rising behind them. And he pushed forward without hesitation, guiding Lyra with him into the narrow passage where the heat dropped slightly, but the pressure in the air intensified, thicker now, heavier, like the space itself was aware of their movement, tracking it. Do not stop, Lyra said again, her voice low but urgent, though this time there was something else beneath it, something personal, something that had nothing to do with survival protocols or calculated outcomes. And Ethan nodded once, his breathing shallow now, each inhale thinner than the last as his oxygen system finally crossed into failure, the steady hum cutting out and leaving only the sound of his own breath echoing inside the helmet, unfiltered, raw. Yeah, he managed, voice rougher now. I am not planning to. And he meant it, even as his vision blurred at the edges, even as every step felt heavier than the one before, his focus narrowing to the simple act of moving forward. because that was all that mattered, not the thing rising behind them, not the system failures, just the next step, and the one after that, and the one after that, until there were no steps left to take. Ethan, Lyra said again. Closer now, her hand tightening around his arm in a way that grounded him more than the failing structure beneath his feet. If it recognizes me fully, it may not allow you to leave, she repeated, her voice steadier than the situation warranted, and Ethan let out a faint breath that might have been a laugh if there had been more air to spare. Yeah, he said, you mentioned that, and she stopped for a fraction of a second, forcing him to slow with her, her luminous eyes locking onto his visor with an intensity that cut through everything else. You still do not understand, she said, softer now, not trying to convince him but needing him to see it clearly. It will not negotiate, it will not reason, it does not perceive value the way we do. If it becomes aware of you through me, you may become part of what it holds. And for a moment the corridor seemed to narrow further, the flickering lights dimming as another deep pulse rolled through the structure. Closer now, stronger, the glow behind them spilling into the passage in thin, shifting lines that traced along the walls like something searching, and Ethan stopped just long enough to meet her gaze properly, not rushing past the moment, not deflecting it with humor or stubbornness, just looking at her as the reality of what she was saying settled into place. And then he gave a small, almost tired nod. Then I guess we make sure it notices me first, he said, and that caught her off guard, her expression shifting in a way he had not seen before, something like shock breaking through her composure. That is not what I meant, she said quickly, but he was already moving again, pulling her forward as the corridor began to tilt slightly, the structure responding to forces it could no longer support. I know, he replied, voice steady despite the strain. But you said it recognizes you, right? And she hesitated, then nodded once, uncertain now. Yes, she said, and Ethan exhaled slowly, focusing on the path ahead where the corridor opened into a wider chamber, its far end marked by a partially active exit gate that flickered between states. Then it is looking for something familiar, he continued, more to himself than to her, piecing it together in the only way he knew how, not with complete understanding but with instinct. And I am not that. And Lyra watched him as they moved, really watched him now, her earlier certainty unraveling into something else, something deeper, because what he was suggesting was not strategy in the way her people would define it. It was not control or containment. It was something far simpler and far more unpredictable. You would draw its attention to yourself, she said slowly, and Ethan gave a faint, almost absent smile as the exit gate ahead flickered again, unstable but reachable. If that is what it takes, he said, and the light behind them surged once more, flooding the corridor in a soft, overwhelming glow that carried with it that same vast awareness, closer now, focused, and for the first time since it began to rise, it felt like it was no longer just noticing them, it was choosing to. The light did not rush forward, it unfolded, slow and absolute, filling the chamber ahead of Ethan Cole like something that had never needed to move quickly because nothing had ever escaped it. And for the first time he stopped not because he wanted to, but because his body refused another step, his legs locking under the weight of exhaustion and failing systems, the last trace of oxygen gone from his suit as the world narrowed to heat, pressure, and the steady echo of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. And beside him Lyra tightened her grip on his arm, not pulling him forward now, but holding him steady, her presence the only thing anchoring him as the air itself seemed to thicken into something almost tangible. It is here, she said, and there was no distance left in her voice, no barrier between her and what was rising, only recognition, and Ethan forced his head up, forcing his vision to focus through the haze as the chamber around them shifted, the fractured walls no longer static but lined with those same luminous strands of light that moved in slow, deliberate patterns, converging toward a single point ahead of them where the glow intensified into something that almost resembled form, not a shape he could define, not something with edges or boundaries, but presence, vast and quiet, and impossibly aware. And for a moment, everything else fell away. The heat, the failing structure, the distant collapse of the city, all of it reduced to background noise compared to the simple, overwhelming fact that something was looking at them, truly looking, not scanning, not measuring, but perceiving, Lyra. Ethan said, his voice barely more than a breath now, raw and unfiltered. This is the part where you tell me there is a plan. And she did not answer right away. Her gaze fixed forward as her luminous skin brightened slightly, not from energy, but from something internal, something responding to the presence before them. And when she spoke, her voice carried a weight he had not heard before. There is no plan that ensures your survival, she said, and that honesty in it landed without hesitation, without comfort, just truth. And Ethan let out a faint exhale that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. Yeah, he murmured, figured. And then he did something that surprised even himself. He stepped forward, one slow, deliberate movement that brought him closer to the center of the chamber, closer to the source of the light, closer to whatever it was that had turned an entire city into something it could no longer recognize. And Lyra's hand tightened around his arm. Ethan, she said, sharper now, a warning and something more, something that sounded dangerously close to fear. If you move closer, it will focus entirely on you. And he nodded once, not looking back at her, his eyes fixed on the shifting radiance ahead. That is the idea, he replied, and for a moment there was silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind that settled between decisions, between what was and what came next, and then Lyra stepped forward. With him, not pulling him back, not trying to stop him, just matching his movement, her presence at his side no longer defined by distance or doubt, but by choice. And that changed something in the space between them, something neither of them spoke aloud. And the light responded, not with movement, but with attention, narrowing, focusing, the vast presence drawing inward just enough to make it clear that it had chosen where to look. And Ethan felt it then, not as pressure or heat, but as awareness brushing against him, not hostile, not kind, simply curious in a way that made everything else seem small. And he swallowed against the dryness in his throat, forcing the words out despite the weight pressing against his chest. Hey, he said, voice unsteady but real. If you are looking for someone, you found us. And the light shifted again, the patterns along the walls aligning, converging, as if his voice had introduced something new into a system that had never needed language before. And beside him Lyra inhaled slowly, her gaze moving from the presence back to him. Something profound and unspoken settling into her expression as she realized what he was doing, not fighting, not escaping, but offering himself as the point of focus. And for the first time since the city began to fall, she did not question him. She did not resist. She simply stood with him as the distance between them and the unknown closed, and the light leaned closer, not physically, but perceptually, until it felt like the entire chamber existed within a single moment of recognition. And Ethan held his ground, not because he was unafraid, but because leaving had never been the choice he made. The light did not answer in words. It responded in attention, tightening around Ethan Cole like a question that had never needed to be asked before, and he felt it move across him in slow, deliberate layers, not touching his body, but something deeper, something behind his thoughts, as if it was learning the shape of him in real time. And for a moment his breath caught, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense of being seen without filter, without distance, every choice, every hesitation. Every reason he had for standing there laid open in a way no system or species had ever done before. And still he did not step back, because stepping back would mean breaking the only thing he had offered, presence. And beside him Lyra remained still, her luminous skin glowing softly in response to the same awareness, her connection to it undeniable now, visible in the way the light around her shifted with a subtle familiarity that it did not show toward him. It recognizes me, she whispered. And Ethan nodded faintly, though his eyes never left the shifting radiance ahead. Yeah, he said quietly, but it is still looking at me. And that was the difference, the narrow edge they were standing on, the reason he had moved forward in the first place, because whatever this presence was, it had expected her, it understood her in ways he could not. But him, he was something else, something unanticipated, and that was where choice existed. And the light pulsed again, softer now, more focused, the vast patterns along the chamber walls slowing, aligning, as if recalibrating around a new variable. And Ethan felt a strange pressure build in his chest, not physical, not the lack of air, but something like expectation, as if the silence itself was waiting for him to complete it, and he swallowed once, forcing his voice through the dryness, through the weight of being observed. She did not deserve to be left behind, he said, the words simple, direct, carrying no complexity beyond what he meant, and for a second nothing changed. The light remained as it was, vast and unreadable, and then something subtle shifted, not in form but in focus, the awareness narrowing further, deeper, as if that statement had introduced a concept it had not fully encountered before, and Lyra's breath caught softly beside him, her gaze moving from the light back to Ethan, something like realization spreading across her expression as she understood what he was doing, not explaining, not negotiating, but showing. Your kind defines worth differently, she said, more to the presence than to him, her voice steadier now, carrying a quiet conviction that had not been there before, and Ethan let out a slow breath, the edges of his vision darkening slightly as his body reminded him how little time he had left, but he pushed that aside, focusing only on the moment in front of him. We do not define it, he said, voice softer now, but no less certain. We choose it. And that seemed to resonate in a way nothing else had, not as sound but as pattern, the light shifting in response, the strands along the walls altering their flow, slower, more deliberate, as if processing something that did not fit into its existing structure. And for the first time since it had begun to rise, there was a pause, not in movement but in intent, a hesitation that rippled through the space like a breath held too long, and Lyra stepped forward then, not away from him but closer, her presence aligning with his in a way that bridged the gap between them, her voice steady as she spoke into that same awareness. I was part of what woke you, she said, no longer hiding from that truth, no longer distancing herself from it. But he is not part of that. And Ethan felt her hand tighten slightly on his arm, grounding him again as the pressure around them shifted, the light drawing closer, not in a threatening way but in something more focused, more precise, as if examining the difference between them, the connection it understood and the one it did not. And in that moment Ethan realized something that changed everything. It was not choosing between them. It was trying to understand why he had chosen her, and that was something no system could calculate, no containment protocol could predict, and he exhaled slowly, the last of his strength settling into a single, steady presence as he held his ground, not as a challenge, not as defiance, but as an answer, and the light responded, not by closing in but by shifting away from Lyra, just slightly, just enough to make it clear where its attention now rested, and for the first time since they entered the chamber, Ethan felt the balance change, not in their favor, not yet, but away from certainty and into something far more human, possibility. The pause stretched, not empty but full, like the moment before something irreversible chose its direction, and Ethan Cole felt it settle around him. The immense presence no longer scanning or probing but holding, as if it had reached a boundary it did not know how to cross. And for the first time since the city began to fall, the air did not press harder, it steadied, the heat no longer climbing, the vibrations beneath them easing into something quieter, something almost still, and he realized, with a slow, distant clarity that this was not resistance, it was consideration, and that thought alone felt impossible, that something so vast, so beyond definition, could hesitate because of a single choice made by someone it should not even have noticed. It is slowing, Lyra whispered, her voice carrying on now, not fear. Her luminous skin dimming to a softer glow as the light around them shifted, no longer rising in relentless waves, but settling into a pattern that felt less like expansion and more like focus. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath shallow but steady, his body heavy with exhaustion, vision narrowing at the edges as the lack of oxygen caught up with him. But he held himself upright, held his ground, because whatever was happening here required presence, not strength, and he had given all the strength he had long ago. Then we keep it that way, he murmured, more to himself than to her, and the light responded again, not by moving closer but by changing, the strands along the walls loosening, drifting, as if the rigid structure it had imposed on this space was no longer necessary. And for a moment the chamber felt less like a containment and more like something else entirely, something open, something undecided. It is trying to understand your choice, Lyra said, her gaze fixed on the shifting radiance, her voice carrying a quiet certainty that had replaced the earlier warnings. Your presence is contradictory to its patterns. And Ethan let out a faint breath, the corners of his mouth twitching in something that might have been a tired smile. Yeah, he said softly. That tracks. And the simplicity of that answer seemed to echo in the space between them, not as sound but as intent, and the light shifted again. A subtle movement that drew a portion of its awareness away from him, not retreating but expanding outward, touching the edges of the chamber, the fractured walls, the broken structure beyond, as if reassessing the entire system it had awakened within, and then it changed direction, not toward him, not toward Lyra, but toward the corridor behind them, the path they had come from, the path that still led outward. And for a moment Ethan did not move, did not react, because he did not trust it yet, did not assume anything from something that did not think in the same way he did. But Lyra's breath caught softly. It is opening a path, she said, and there was something in her voice that made him look, really look, and he saw it then, the light along the corridor receding just enough to reveal structure again, the flickering lights stabilizing, the pressure easing, not completely, not safely, but enough to move, enough to leave, and Ethan swallowed against the dryness in his throat, the realization settling in slowly, heavily, because this was not something they had taken, not something they had forced. This was something given, and that made it matter more than anything else. Why? He asked quietly, not expecting an answer but needing to voice the question, and for a long moment there was nothing, just the soft hum of the chamber and the distant echo of a city that no longer burned the same way it had before. And then the light shifted once more, not in a way he could interpret directly, but in a pattern that brushed against his awareness just enough to leave an impression, not words, not language, but something simpler, something that felt like recognition of a choice it had not predicted. And Ethan exhaled slowly, understanding not the mechanism but the meaning, and he turned slightly toward Lyra, his movement slower now, heavier. Looks like we got an exit, he said, voice rough but steady, and she looked at him, really looked, her luminous eyes reflecting the softened glow around them. And there was something in her expression that had not been there before, something like respect, something like quiet disbelief, and something deeper, something that had nothing to do with survival or systems or the thing beneath the city. Ethan, she said softly, and for a moment that was all she said, because there were no words in her language, or his, that could fully hold what had just happened. And he gave a small nod, not because he needed acknowledgement, but because he understood what it meant. And then he turned back toward the corridor, toward the path that had been closed to them only moments before, and took a step forward, not because he believed it was safe, but because it was open, and sometimes that was enough. The corridor did not feel like escape. It felt like a decision that had not yet settled, and Ethan Cole moved through it one step at a time with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who had nothing left to give except the act of continuing, his breath shallow and uneven in the open air, every inhale carrying the lingering heat of a city that was no longer burning the way it had before. And behind him the chamber remained lit, not with the overwhelming surge from before, but with a steady, distant glow that no longer pressed against his back, no longer demanded anything from him. And that alone felt like the strangest part of it all, that something so vast could simply choose to stop. And Lyra walked beside him in silence, her presence close, her luminous skin dim but stable now, her gaze forward yet drifting back in brief, quiet glances as if she was still trying to understand the shape of what had just happened. And for a long time neither of them spoke, because there were no words that fit between what they had faced and what they had been given in return. And the structure around them gradually steadied, the fractured walls giving way to more defined corridors, the flickering lights stabilizing into a soft, consistent glow that guided them forward toward the outer perimeter, where the air finally shifted again, cooler now, thinner in a different way, carrying the distant hum of evacuation ships that had not entirely abandoned the system. And Ethan felt his knees threaten to give beneath him as the adrenaline that had carried him this far finally began to fade, his body reminding him in no uncertain terms how close he had come to its limits. But he did not fall, not yet, because he needed to see the end of the path, needed to know that she would make it out, and Lyra noticed the change before he said anything, her hand tightening around his arm in quiet support as they slowed slightly, matching his pace without comment, without drawing attention to it. And that small, simple adjustment said more than anything else could have, that she had seen him, understood him, not as a variable or a subject, but as something else entirely, something that had chosen her when it did not have to. And the corridor opened at last into the outer platform, the sky beyond still heavy with smoke, but no longer collapsing, the distant silhouettes of ships moving in controlled arcs as emergency protocol stabilized, and Ethan stepped out into it with a breath that felt deeper than the ones before. Even if his lungs still struggled to fill, the open space stretching out ahead of them like something real again, something grounded, and he paused there, just for a second, looking back over his shoulder toward the place they had come from, toward the faint, steady glow that still lingered within the city. And he did not know if it was watching anymore, did not know if it understood what it had done, but he knew it had made a choice, and that mattered. And Lyra followed his gaze, her expression quiet, thoughtful, her voice softer than he had ever heard it when she finally spoke. "It let us leave," she said, and Ethan nodded once, the motion slow but certain. "Yeah," he replied. "It did." And for a moment they stood there together, two figures on the edge of something that had almost ended differently, the silence between them no longer empty but full. And then Lyra turned to him fully, her luminous eyes meeting his with a clarity that carried everything she could not put into words. "They believed power was control," she said quietly, almost to herself. "But you showed it something else." And Ethan let out a faint breath, the hint of a tired smile crossing his face as he looked out over the horizon where the first signs of stability were returning. "I did not show it anything," he said, voice low but steady. "I just stayed." And that was the truth of it, simple and unadorned. Not a strategy, not a plan, just a choice made in a moment where leaving would have been easier. And Lyra held his gaze for a second longer before looking back toward the city, toward the glow that no longer threatened but simply existed. And there was something like understanding in her expression now, something that had not been there when he first found her beneath the rubble, something that had nothing to do with species or systems, and everything to do with the quiet, stubborn force of a single decision. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of everything settling into him at last as his strength finally gave way, his knees bending just enough for him to catch himself before he fell. And Lyra was there immediately, steadying him without hesitation, her presence close and unwavering as the world around them continued to move forward. And for a moment, he let himself lean into that, not as weakness but as balance, as something shared. And the sky above them began to clear, just slightly, a thin line of light breaking through the smoke, casting a soft glow across the platform and the city beyond. And in that quiet, fragile moment, there was no sound of alarms, no collapsing structures, no overwhelming presence pressing against them, just the steady rhythm of breath and the faint warmth of light returning. And somewhere behind them, deep within the city that had almost been lost, something vast and ancient remained still, not conquered, not destroyed, but changed in a way it had never been before, because for the first time, it had not been met with fear or force, but with something it could not calculate and could not ignore. And as Ethan closed his eyes for just a second, letting the light settle against his face, the thought came not as a statement, but as something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken aloud. He was never meant to conquer the stars. He was only ever meant to remind them what hearts were for.